10 books that you must read before you die. I'm a pretty avid reader. I read about 30 books a year. My goal is 35 this year. We'll see if we make it. These are the top 10 most important novels that I've ever come across in all of my reading experiences. I have a variety of different genres in my pile here, and we will start with the lowest priority and work our way up to the highest priority. So starting with book number 10, we have Eagle in the Sky by Wilbur Smith. This is an older book. I read this in high school, and I gotta say, this is the only book I have ever read this many times. I have read this book 3 times, which is insane to me. I'm not typically a rereader like ever because there's just no time in the day for that. And I'm already a slow reader. I don't have time to re-experience books that I've already read when I have a TBR as aggressive as the pile that is continually growing every single day. This one was a recommendation from my father, and my father is also incredibly well read. And I picked this up with zero expectations. When you read the back, it really doesn't sound all that captivating, but my goodness, I was so floored and so enthralled by this work of fiction that I just couldn't put it down. This is the only book that I've read back to back, as in I finished the last page, I started back at page 1, and then years later, I read it again. For some reason, this story always sticks with me, and honestly, I can't even really tell you what it is about it that I really fell in love with. And that's the reason it's at number 10. It's a really old book. It was experienced by me some time ago, but I just remember loving this story. It follows 2 characters, Deborah and David. David is a very attractive, very gifted pilot. He's not perfect. I will be the first to admit that there are some things that I did not like about him in this book, but he absolutely grows on you. And I think that's what also makes him very real, is he's not perfect. And then he, of course, meets Deborah. I would call this, at his heart, a romance. There is a lot of tragedy that happens with Deborah. She actually survives a terrorist attack that leaves her blind. Something tragic also happens with David, and they learn to navigate these new challenges of their lives together. And it is just such a moving, beautiful masterpiece. I will always recommend it. It is a little bit older. Oh my gosh, my copy is so beat up, but this 1974. So yeah, not a new release, but I had to go way back in my book journal to when I had written about it. And it's fairly short. It's 373 pages, very easy to digest. I give it 10s across the board. By the way, every single book that I'm going to talk about in this video is a 5-star. I absolutely loved it. I wouldn't be recommending any of these books otherwise, but I have to just make a comment on something that I had written in my book journal. I'm so glad I kept these journals because I have 3 that go way back from when I was first starting to really get into reading. And I said, this by far is my most favorite book. Wilbur Smith is my most favorite author, and I think this is his greatest masterpiece, which I have read a lot of other Wilbur Smiths. It's been some time, but back in the day, he was my dude. I read all of his stuff. But I said, this is the 3rd time I've read it and the only book I've ever read twice in a row. After I completed this book, that same day, I started reading it from the beginning. It's an incredible story that I'm sure I will read again. It's a great romance intertwined with adventure and horror. It has every emotion in this book. You fall in love with the hero and despise the villain. Deborah and David are my favorite novel characters who have suffered great loss, but still managed to carve out a perfect paradise for themselves together in magical Jablani. And even in their handicaps, you admire them and wish they were real. I love this beautiful book. Eagle in the Sky, number 10. Book number 9 is none other than Verity by Colleen Hoover. This might seem like kind of a funny pick. It is a psychological thriller, so if that's not your genre, I might take pause. I may not recommend this to everyone because this is an intense thriller. I've read a lot of thrillers and psychological thrillers. This by far has every single one of them beat. I read The Silent Patient some time ago, which was really popular back probably a year and a half ago. And this one, I'm sorry, just blew that one out of the water. I also really liked Girl on a Train, which they made a really great movie out of that one as well. Both great. Movie was great. Book was great. This tops that one as well. But this is a crazy psychological thriller. This one had me just on the edge of my seat for such a long time. When I say a long time, it didn't take me a long time to read, but I just was ravenous when I was reading through this. I just could not believe these characters. I could not believe what was happening. I was completely floored. And Colleen Hoover does not hold back in this book. So that is why this makes my top top 10 video. Kind of a funny pick. So if you're not into psychological thrillers, I may not recommend this one, but this one is insane. This follows a character named Llewellyn Ashley. She is hired to finish a series that was started by a writer or author named Verity. Verity has suffered an accident and is no longer able to complete her book series. Llewellyn ends up getting all these manuscripts in order to finish the series that Verity had started, but in the process ends up coming across a manuscript or a autobiography that Verity had written, and it is incredibly disturbing. This book is just so creepy, and you will be floored by the stuff that happens. This one is just so popular, and there is definitely a reason why. It is just insane. Consulting my book journal. I read this in August of 2022. I read it in 3 days. So obviously I couldn't put it down. That's extraordinarily fast for me because I'm a very, very slow reader, but it's only 314 pages, so it doesn't take you long. I just said I am absolutely blown away by this book. Thrilling, creepy, beautiful, disturbing, haunting, and completely captivating. I loved it. I didn't expect it whatsoever. This book was wildly different from It Ends With Us, which I didn't care for, by the same author. This was on par with Girl on a Train. The characters were so memorable and relatable, and I was thoroughly creeped out by Verity. What a character. I understand the hype. This book has been all over Book Talk, and for good reason. I devoured it, and I never knew where it was headed. Kept me guessing. How is it that I liked Verity, but also hated her, but also understood her at the same time? Mind blown. That's what I wrote. So that's number 9. Number 8 is going to be Nevernight by Kristoff. This is one of the most beautifully written novels I've ever come across. If you just read the first page, I'm willing to bet that you're going to be hooked right off the bat. Just the way that Kristoff writes is just absolutely gorgeous. So he's got it all. He has the beautiful writing and he has the amazing storytelling. I gotta say, for me personally, beautiful writing is a bonus. It's not a necessity. I go into a book exclusively for the story. I don't really care if the writing is bad as long as I'm entertained by the story. Now, if it's the opposite, if it's well written but the story is boring as hell, I'm not going to like it. I'm not going to rate it very highly. I may not even finish it. I may just DNF it at that point. But this has the best of both worlds. This follows a woman named Mia Corvair. She is the daughter of a traitor who was executed, and you read about that right off the bat. She ends up gaining entry into a school for assassins, and then just everything kind of unfolds from there. This is going to fall under the dark fantasy genre. Oh my gosh, I just loved it. And I don't even know where to start because it's so good, but this is part of a trilogy. I have the other 2, and honestly, I haven't read them yet, only because you need to take your time when reading Kristoff. You cannot fly through it because you just want to appreciate his writing style. You want to appreciate his storytelling. And so I need to carve out a significant chunk of time for that. This is not something I would fly through because I feel like I would be doing myself a disservice by doing that. So that's going to be number 8, Nevernight, Kristoff. Absolutely amazing. Could not recommend it enough. I also read this one in 2022. It actually took me over a month, which that's a pretty long time, but I know it's because I was appreciating it and I'm sure I was busy at the time. But this is 427 pages, classified as a dark fantasy. I said, wow, I loved it. My sister read it, insisted that I read it as well, and I'm so glad I did. It's like Harry Potter, but more blood, sex, cursing, and overall violence, and beautifully, beautifully written. I am more than impressed by Kristoff. I was floored by some of the genius twists and very much admired Mia for her strength and wit and overall badassery. The footnotes were hysterical in a smart-ass, humorous way. I've never read a more captivating introduction. This book will hook you on page 1. What a work of art, just a masterpiece. Number 6 is going to be the only autobiography from this pile, and it is by Fredrik Backman. Backman, shoot. I don't know, but he's Swedish, so however you would pronounce that. It's Things My Son Needs to Know About the World. I read this so quickly, and it was everything that I wanted, everything that I needed, and honestly, so much more. This absolutely exceeded my expectations, which Fredrik Backman has a habit of doing that. I pick up his books expecting to enjoy them, but I really, really enjoy them, and he just blows me away. I love the way that he writes. He is very sarcastic. He writes with a lot of humor, which I understand that's not everybody's style. Sometimes I feel like it might be overwhelming for certain audiences. For me, I love his humor, and I have never related to a book more. So if you're a parent parents, 100% you have to read this. This really resonated with me on a very deep level because my son, very young, he's only 4.5 months, but every anecdote that Fredrik Backman talks about in this book, I have lived at least some version of that, and it made me feel not alone. It made me feel understood, and just, I love everything about it. There's nothing negative that I have to say about this book. Fredrik Backman takes very complicated subjects and tries to condense it into a understandable way for his son to be able to process. He talks about things like good and evil, things like religion, things like love, all very difficult to teach, but he makes it understandable, and it's genius. I don't know what else to say, but yes. So this is number 6 in 10 books you have to read before you die. Number 5 is actually going to be another dark fantasy novel, and it is Trials for the Haunted by J.J. Kimmorist. I just love this one. It's so well written. I love the plot. It follows a young girl named Sindra who fails to perform a human sacrifice in her village, and therefore it causes this crazy attack. So there's a reason that the sacrifices have to happen, but because she failed to do that, her village is now suffering the consequences, and they're pretty bad. So Sindra goes to a place called Terra as a way to seek redemption for her actions. She has to go through all of these trials, and I love the trials. They're actually really, really cool. But meanwhile, she's haunted by the ghosts of her past lives, which is actually pretty cool. She's kind of like an old soul. She makes a lot of mistakes, which makes her very relatable. She's believable. I really liked her as a character, even though sometimes you're like, come on, man, you can do it. You can't help rooting for her. But honestly, I was just extremely entertained, and I have read this one twice. Again, I'm not a rereader by nature. I don't have time for that. But for the books that are worth it, I make time. So absolutely love it. This is going to be your number 5 in this video, Trials for the Haunted. This is going to be part of a trilogy, but as far as I know, only the first one has come out. I think the second one is coming soon. I got to look that up because I hope it's really soon. Trials for the Haunted, J.J. Kimmorist, number 6 on the list. Couldn't recommend it enough. Number 5 on my list is going to be These Is My Words by Nancy Turner. This book to this day is the only book that has ever made me bawl my eyes out. No other book has even made me cry, yet this one just destroyed me. I was heartbroken. At its core, it is a love story, and it's actually based off of the author's relatives, so it's kind of like a tribute to them. This follows Sarah Prine, and it follows her journey through the Arizona territories and just the struggles back in the day. It's just wild to hear about this woman's life and how her relationship with Captain Jack Elliott unfolds throughout the story. It is beautiful. It's well written. I just loved it. This is such a beautiful book, and I really put it off for a while because I didn't love the title. Obviously, it contained a grammatical error, but there's a very specific reason for that. So I love this book. Again, there's actually more books from this author, I think around the same characters or her same family members. I haven't read them yet because I need to be emotionally prepared. When I'm looking for something to destroy me emotionally, I will pick up one of her books, but incredibly well written, beautifully written, great story, and honestly, one of the best love stories I've ever read, ever. I actually read this one in 2020 in the middle of the pandemic, and I'm reviewing my notes on it, and all I said was, I am stunned. What an incredible book. Wow. This is the only book that has ever made me cry. Full-blown tears of sadness. This book rips my heart into two, but it was so beautifully done. Sarah's an incredible character, so strong and admirable. The love story between her and Jack was unlike anything I've ever experienced. A power couple, to say the very least. My favorite quote comes from page 357. In so many things, he is rough and ornery, but in ways of our family, he is always so gentle. It's like I'm married to two different men. I love them both and need them equally. This story was real. Turner highlights every human emotion. This book brought me so much joy, but also so much sadness. I'm so incredibly impressed. My interest in the events never lulled. So much happens in this strong woman's life, you won't want it to end. And maybe that's why I had such a strong reaction to it, is that these characters are actually real. These characters are not fictional, and they felt very real because they are real. And so I just felt like a deeper connection to them, and I really cared about what happened to them. So number 5 These is my words. Number 4 is going to be by Christian Hanna. This is the Nightingale. Had to throw historical fiction in there. I'm not typically a historical fiction reader, but this one just blew me away. It got very, very popular a couple years ago. I just remember absolutely falling in love with the characters. It follows two sisters, and anything with two sisters, I am immediately interested in because I myself have my sister. Her and I have always been very, very close. So anything that involves two sisters, I usually am all for it. So this one follows the two sisters who are in the midst of World War II, and they both have their own way of assisting throughout the war. They're very different people, which reminded me of my sister and I, because very different people, but we got along. We always got along super, super well. And that's really all you need to know about it. I just simply, from an enjoyment standpoint, 5 out of 5. I loved it. It was really, really well written. Christian Hanna is an amazing author. I've read a couple of her other books, and this one by far was my favorite. This one's a little more hefty. It's 564 pages, of course, a historical fiction. He read it in 2019, so it's been some time, and all I said is, what an incredible read. Christian Hanna may be my favorite female author. This was an incredibly emotional story because it was based in real events in World War II. The scenes in concentration camps were all too real, and the brutality of life in France during German invasion is egregious. The story will make your heart hurt. I so enjoyed this book, and I'm glad I read it, but I would never read it again simply because I don't want to re-experience the heartache. Christian Hanna presented her readers with incredible heroines that were brave in their own individual ways. The two sisters risked their lives to help strangers. In Vianne's case, she also risked the safety of her daughter to do the right thing. Love, courage, determination, fear, murder, confusion, hatred, slaughter, secrecy. This story had it all. So there you have it. There is number 4. Book number 3 is going to be Shantaram by David Gregory Roberts. This one got me out of a reading slump because I don't know what it was. There was a long period of time where I just didn't read. Nothing really interested me. I tried to pick up a couple books. Nothing really captured my attention until this one came along. And honestly, I had zero expectations. This was actually a gift from a friend. And honestly, I didn't know if we preferred the same reading material. So I went in kind of skeptical. This one was so entertaining and it's so real. And this author actually had written about his own personal experiences. Now, I don't know. Haven't researched it. I don't know how much of it is actually true. I think a big portion of it. I don't know if he embellished or created any type of fiction to go along with it, but it's such a fascinating tale about his life. This man, David Gregory Roberts, he actually escaped a prison in Australia, ended up living in the slums of India, and there's just a bunch of stuff that happens to him, and it was really very interesting. I just couldn't believe it. I was stunned. I mean, this is a hefty book. It's not short. He was sentenced to 19 years in prison for a series of armed robberies, so kind of a funny, like you wouldn't think that you would root for this character knowing his backstory and his history, but honestly, I was so much on his side. I really wanted to see him succeed. I was just very much invested and on his side the entire time. So Shantaram. This one goes way back to 2015. So it's been quite some time since I read this book, but it still holds up. I still think of this book all the time. I still think that it is easily a 5-star read. Nothing has really changed my perspective on it. Even though I've read a lot of books since then, I still consider it one of my top books of all time. And whoa, it's actually almost 1,000 pages. It's 936 pages. I classified it as adventure, romance, suspense, murder, has all the good things. I said, this is an incredible novel. I have fallen in love with Lin Baba and his talent for writing, and he is a criminal. It's amazing to cherish a character you expect to actually hate. You support him throughout the book, even when he is committing crimes. You pray that he escapes unscathed. His writing is beautiful. His adventures are captivating. I absolutely cannot wait until his sequel comes out. This book held my attention throughout all 936 pages. I learned a lot of new vocabulary. After 936 pages, I was sad that it ended. I have thought about this book in length as I journeyed through it, but expect to relive this story as its impression has made an indelible brand on my imagination. Wow, what a review. I wrote that a while ago. That's good. That's impressive. But I actually, since I've written this review, I have read the sequel. It's called The Mountain Shadow, and it's good. It's not as good as this one, though. I gotta say, this one definitely, if you want to read the sequel, that's great, but I was much more a fan of this one. Highly, highly, highly recommend. Number 2 is going to be Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett. By the way, Ken Follett, anything Ken Follett is good. You might want to check it out. If you're not really into heavy politics, you might want to do some research on some of his books, because Ken Follett does a ton of research into his books, and because he writes a lot of historical fiction, a lot of what he writes about is incredibly accurate. And there are some of his books that I don't love quite as much because there's so much political dialogue, and I'm not as interested or excited about that as I am just by like the events and the fighting and the action and all the other stuff. But this one is the perfect book. Definitely not overly political like Fall of Giants. I really loved Fall of Giants, but would definitely prefer and recommend Pillars of the Earth over Fall of Giants. But this one 100% got me obsessed into reading again, because I read this way back in the day. I was in college, and honestly, I didn't really have time to read. I was working at the same time as I was going to school, and I really had very little spare time. But I picked this up kind of on a whim. I'd heard a lot of good things about it. It's rated really high on Goodreads. Actually, all 10 of these books are rated super high on Goodreads. I'm pretty sure all of them are either 4 stars or above, but this one got me obsessed. I was obsessed with the storyline. I was obsessed with the characters, and it really kicked off my reading journey, and I've been reading ever since. So I'd like to say I've read my entire life, but I definitely took long breaks, especially when life got busy and I just didn't have the time. But this got me rolling. So this has the worst villain you will ever read. His name is William, and you will hate this guy. So Ken Follett does a really good job creating villains that you really hope they end up dying in the end, because you just can't freaking stand them. But this is a beautiful tale that follows Aliena. I actually didn't know that's how you pronounce her name until I watched the miniseries, which they actually did a decent job of. But I was always calling her Alina, but it's actually Aliena. Her and Jack have this beautiful romance story. I honestly don't have too much to say about this one. I think at its core, it is a beautifully written romance. It follows the building and construction of a cathedral, which doesn't sound interesting, but it totally is quite fascinating. There's Tom the builder, who was contracted to do this work. There's also Philip Pryor, who you end up really loving. He's an oddly lovable character. You don't expect a character like that to really just capture your heart, and he totally does. I don't really get it. But this is number 2, Pillars of the Earth. There is a sequel to it. Actually, there's many Kingsbridge novels. This is number 1 of the Kingsbridge novels, but it is by far the best. It's so good. I recommend this book to everyone. Nobody really takes me up on this recommendation because it's thick, and I think people have commitment issues when it comes to reading thick books, but I promise you, it's so worth it. I recommend this book all the time, and I read it way back in the day. I read this in the summer of 2016, and it is 973 pages. It's pretty hefty, but so worth it. I absolutely recommend it. I actually wrote, I have a new favorite book. This is my absolute favorite novel. I fell in love with the love story between Jack and Aliena. I itched with hatred for William, mourned for Tom, and seethed with displeasure with Alfred, Walter, and Bishop Walleran. Immediately after completing this book, I purchased the miniseries and have been watching it. It's okay. Does not do the book justice. There was too many changes in the movie, and the characters are never quite like you imagine them. However, I am pleased with the actor that plays Jack. Very charming and fitting. I'm already 200 pages into the sequel, World Without End, and I'm enjoying it very much. I have pages of notes on Pillars, great quotes, and new words I learned. Educational and enjoyable. I highly recommend. 1 million stars. So yes, there you go. That's number 2. At long last, we've made it to number 1, which I can't talk about number 1 without bringing up the very first part of this series. Okay, so number 1 is going to be Words of Radiance. This is just my favorite book, but it is number 2 in the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. So I have this one right here. This one is wonderful. Don't get me wrong. Way of Kings is absolutely wonderful. I was completely obsessed when I read this one, but I gotta say, there is something about Words of Radiance. Maybe because you're already invested in the world, you know the characters. There's really no growing pains when you start reading this. Anytime you start a new fantasy, I think there are growing pains because you're trying to understand a new world. You're trying to understand the magic system. You're trying to learn who the characters are. There's a lot going on. So these characters, everything is already established by the time you get to Words of Radiance. This book gave me physical chills at so many different parts of the book. I'm rating this number 1 simply because I enjoyed this book probably more so than any other book I have ever read. I would love to reread it, but it's going to be a huge commitment because I can't reread this one without rereading the first one. And then now, Brandon Sanderson, he's already written the first 4. He's working on the 5th one right now. So I've read all of them. This one by far was my absolute favorite. Anything Sanderson, I really love, but this one, just for some reason, I don't know what it is. I just loved it. Love the characters. I can't even give you a summary of it or even a synopsis because there's so much going on in these books. But really, I guess the main plot line that you need to know about, it really follows Kaladin Stormblessed, who is actually a slave who ends up in Bridge 4, and he becomes like a leader figure. And by the way, Brandon Sanderson, he really understands leadership. I don't really know how, because he's a genius when it comes to that. But the way he talks about leadership and getting people to follow you and developing loyalty, it's just quite amazing. So you have Kaladin as probably your most central main character, which you fall in love with Kaladin. He's not perfect, but he's funny and he's quirky and you just love him. You're also following a young female named Shallan. She's an artist. You also have Jasna. You also have Dalinar. You have Adolin. There are just a lot of characters. So it's really tough to even come up with a good synopsis of the story other than it is wonderful. I guess I'll just leave it at this. Centuries ago, the Knights Radiant actually fell, but their shard plate and shard blades still exist, and kingdoms fall for those plates and blades, and it causes wars, and there's all these things. So this is in the middle of a war. I'll keep it simple. This story revolves around a war that is currently going on. Kaladin has been introduced to slavery. He actually has a big slave brand on his forehead, which just actually contributes to him being kind of a badass. And so all of these characters are impacted by this war, and I think I'm just going to leave it at that. So I just love, love, love Brandon Sanderson's characters. Every single one of them is very memorable, even though there's a lot of them. Whenever I go back to read another one of his Stormlight Archive books, I'm never lost or wondering who the heck is this person, even if it's been years since I read one of his books, because they just stick so firmly in my mind that it's really easy to recall, oh, I remember Lopin. I know who that is. Oh yeah, I obviously know who Pattern is. And Syl, easy. So give it a shot. You obviously have to start with this one, start with Way of Kings, but this one, number one on my list, Words of Radiance, I cannot recommend this one enough. It just, the overall feeling that I got from it is just unmatched. And honestly, when I'm talking about books, sometimes I don't recall plot lines very well, but I tend to remember characters and I remember the way the book made me feel. So really, this is more of a reflection on when I read this way back in the day, it made me feel a certain type of way, and it was wonderful. This book is hefty. It's 1,310 pages, and all I said was, most incredible. Wow. Even better than the first. I cannot wait for the sequel, which is Oathbringer, but I will be so sad to have to wait for the fourth book to come out. We are not going to want to wait. I fell in love with Pattern. So naive, but also very smart in some aspects. Bridge 4 forever. That will make sense once you read the book. Thank you so much for sticking with me this far. This was a long video, so I appreciate you hanging in there. Hopefully you found some of this information helpful. Hopefully you go out and start reading some of these books. Any one of them, I really hope you'll be extremely pleased with. If you haven't done so already, please go ahead and subscribe to my channel so you can stay up to date on bookish content, and we'll see you on the flip side.